Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Sunday Shot. We are live today because we are going to be discussing everything to do with the South Australian election results from yesterday. We will ask in advance that you forgive us for any technological gremlins that may enter our system because, as all of our regular viewers will recall, the very reason that we stopped going live was because we just got sick of some of those issues that were recurring. But we've decided to give it a go because we do think it is important to get stuck into important results. For the first time in a while, the eyes of the nation really were on what was going on in South Australian politics. So we have two fantastic South Australian guests joining us today. Firstly, we have Tory Shepherd.
Coming from Ghanaland, Joe. Hi.
Yes, thank you very much.
Little gremlin too.
Yeah. It is great to have you making your debut with us. And we are joined also by Walter Marsh.
Howdy.
And there's Walter too. Welcome to you both, and thank you for joining us early on a Sunday morning, half an hour earlier in Adelaide, of course. Dave is not joining us because Dave knows nothing about South Australian politics. Look, let's get stuck into it straight away. It was an incredibly interesting result that we got through from Adelaide and the surrounds. The headline is, as expected, a really just stonking victory for Malinowskis and the Labor Party. There really was no doubt ever about the conclusion of this election, what was going to happen. Tory Malinowskis seems to be a once-in-a-generation politician in terms of his popularity. He hammers at every turn. He did this in the election debate. He said it, well, Tom Koutsantonis, I think, kept reinforcing it last night on the ABC. He's a centrist leader. So he tries to get wide support from all sections of the population, and he seems to have done that pretty successfully.
Yeah, look, Tony Barry always refers to him as a political athlete. And, you know, he's charismatic, he's eloquent. He's done this thing where he's got business on side. So, you know, traditional kind of liberal forte. And it really is that governing from the centre that has seen him ascendant. Oh, and the fact that the Libs have kind of completely fallen apart has given him somewhat of a helping hand.
Yeah, and we'll get into the collapse of the Liberals and what that means for both the state, but also any national implications. Walter, Malinowskis, he has not been without his flaws over the last 4 years. There was discussion last night and through the election campaign that he really failed to fix what was the key issue of the 22 election campaign, the issue of ramping, ambulances being forced to park outside hospitals while they are waiting for the patients lying there on their gurneys to get a hospital bed. Failed in that miserably, but somehow that didn't seem to be an issue at all in 26.
Yeah, I mean, it was a pretty, you know, the cornflakes for the last election, it was Peter Malinowskis grinning, saying, fix ramping, no basketball stadium. And he hasn't fixed ramping, but he's done a lot of other stuff for just sports and good times. So in terms of that previous election platform, whether or not he's followed through is unclear. But ramping still is obviously an issue. I think generally the voters can probably recognise that it's not for lack of throwing a lot at the issue of healthcare. They've announced this whole new hospital, Women's and Children's Hospital, being built on parklands, antagonising to a different cohort of the population. But, you know, there's definitely been resources funneled into that problem, which is, you know, a pretty intractable one that is not unique to South Australia. And yeah, the Liberals have focused hard on that, pretty clear cut. They said one thing, they haven't delivered it, but obviously it hasn't really landed.
Yeah, we're getting a little bit of a glitch from Walter. I'm not sure if that's translating to the audience as well, but we did warn you of some of the foibles of going live. I mean, that was one of the things that was discussed a bit last night as well by Tom Koutsantonis, particularly on the ABC, as you say, Walter, that they have been trying very hard to fix it. They have been investing quite a bit of money in the healthcare system. But overall, some of the federal issues that play into hospital beds, and particularly around the accessibility of aged care beds, means that you have got older South Australians occupying some of the beds, making it more difficult to get patients, emergency patients in. This was one of the major missteps, though, of the campaign itself, Tory, wasn't it, when Chris Picton tried to deflect some of the criticism of ramping and ended up with a case of mistaken identity for a dead patient. Can you just sort of tell us about that? And even that failed to derail the campaign.
It did. I mean, it was a pretty horrific moment. It was a bit of like, this is how the sausage is made. So what had happened is the wife of a man, Stephen King, had complained that he had been ramped, and as you say, that's when you're sitting outside the hospital because there's no room inside the hospital. And in response to her speaking out about it, somebody under Chris Picton released an email praising SA Health, apparently from Stephen King, different Stephen King. So major error. I do have some sympathy for whatever underling produced that email that, set off this sort of catastrophic chain of events. So it sort of showed, look, we will reveal patients' private information in order to win the PR on this one. That was the sort of brutal truth of it. It was big for a day.
Yeah.
It sort of was no longer.
Then it disappeared.
It just did seem, and Ashton Hearn's such an impressive character, and she was opposition health. This is sort of her forte, but yeah, they just couldn't get traction on anything.
Well, no, and then of course they had the kind of crazy candidate, which is normally more a One Nation feature, where he had been on the fever dream of American kind of Pentecostal podcast talking about demonic gay people and demonic feminists. So, look, the headline is of the 47 seats in the South Australian Parliament, Labor looks to have won 34. The Libs currently have won 4. And they may sneak up a few. They may get up to 5. But One Nation, whilst the ABC has not yet called seats for One Nation, it pretty much looks like they're going to have at least 3. And in both the lower house and potentially the upper house. But they have also taken seats, or they're not so much seats, but they have taken big chunks out of Labor's vote in some of those northeastern working class suburbs, sort of Elizabeth, Salisbury, round there. So there's lessons to be learned for both of the, well, at least formerly major parties here in what this means going forward. But I think the fact that the Liberals, pretty much everywhere there was a retiring minister, that in sort of the seats within Adelaide, the Liberals lost them. So, Walter, they have been pretty much, with the exception of Bragg, which was pretty one of the safest seats within Adelaide, they've been driven out of metropolitan Adelaide.
Yeah, I mean, insofar as what national politics can glean from this incredible One Nation result that we've seen, I think we also need to acknowledge just how uniquely cooked the South Australian Liberal Party has been. They won the previous election under Stephen Marshall, turfed out of office very quickly by Malinowskis, and immediately it's been sort of chaos and confusion for the entire parliamentary term that I think has led to people who don't want to vote for Labor. What would be the incentive for voting for the current pack of Liberals, even now that they've had Ashton Hearn in for a little over 100 days. We had David Spears was the first Liberal leader. He resigned because, if we cast our minds back, he was getting a lot of criticism because he kept buggering off back home to Scotland for family weddings and seemed to be annoyed that people were annoyed about that. Anyway, so he retires, he resigns as leader, and then is outed on the
Not to
front.
mention the drink.
I'm leading to that. He's on the front page of the Advertiser, allegedly. He's pled guilty now, racking lines of something white and linear. That's not great. His successor, Vincent Tarzia, hung in there for a little while, but then bailed because of just this obvious dysfunction that he was trying to cobble together. And this is even Stephen Marshall, when he was the leader, you could sense this kind of, he's barely holding back the dysfunction of the South Australian Liberal Party. And so that's all kind of come crashing into a heap. Plus, David Spears is the tip of the iceberg of legal troubles. I think Casey on the ABC last night, talking about the seat of Mount Gambier, very deadpan said, which is vacant because the current member is in jail. We had Nick McBride as well in one of those country seats. He's been wearing an ankle monitor, which he described as, my issues last night, which is a nice euphemism for it. And presumption of innocence, all that stuff. But, it's not a great look. And it's given, there's very little solid ground for Liberals to stand on. And so that's what's been feeding into this vote. And so the One Nation has, romped home with a huge swing from both parties. But, really they've hemorrhaged or eaten alive the Liberal vote in so many places. I think there is this One Nation, wave across the country, but there's also been a uniquely bad Liberal Party here.
Yeah, I mean, there has been a uniquely bad Liberal Party. I think that is fair to say. And kind of a refusal to acknowledge that within the Liberal Party, and a refusal or a failure to sort of grapple with the implications of what that's going to mean. I mean, as ever, the Liberals have been so at war with each other and espousing some really kind of incredible views in the kind of cultural war policy area. And Alex Antic having been such a sort of, I don't know, I would say ally, but he continues to be very close with Cory Bernardi and ostentatiously drinking, bad beer outside the Exeter, just to sort of show that they, here they are talking, here they are sharing views. I mean, it's difficult to know what they actually thought was going to happen when they continue to behave in these sorts of ways, and they continue to pre-select these type of candidates, Tory.
Yeah, and look, the astounding thing to me is that even though you would think the Liberal Party has learnt this lesson in the past, that you need to win the centre to govern, every time they have a loss, we've got to go further right from people like Alex Antic. So I look forward to him saying that after this state election result. So as Walter said, there are these incredible dramas in individual seats, and then behind all of that is the sort of eternal split of the broad church between the moderates and the conservatives. So you've got Antic taking power in the branches, and then you've got a moderate Ashton Hearn leading, and so then repealing the voice to Parliament somehow becomes a thing that they're talking about, when I don't think that's what people were really talking. And if Ashton wasn't such a strong character, I would feel sorry for her, both being given short shrift in the short length of time that she had there and trying to balance those two sides of the party, because it seems almost insurmountable. In fact, Bernardi many years ago just in a casual conversation said he was feeling like the Liberal Party needed to split itself and then form a coalition with itself so that both sides could kind of be free for their own purposes. And that kind of makes sense. There's nowhere on those culture war issues that they're ever going to meet.
No, and kind of in a weird way, maybe that is in fact what has happened with people like Bernardi now notionally leading leading One Nation in South Australia. And look, he will be elected to the Legislative Council. He will have at least one, if not two, colleagues there with him in the upper house. With the sort of ascendancy of One Nation, and, if that wins 3 seats in the lower house and the Libs only win 4, I mean, they may not have a claim to be the official opposition yet, but they are going to have this strong presence, at least initially, and we have seen what happens with One Nation when they do get seats and a toehold into Parliament, and there is the likelihood that they will implode. But they are going to be key players, and they are rivaling the Liberal Party. I mean, it is extraordinary. Like, I think we do need to recall how extraordinary this is. I mean, Casey was going through at the end of last night the number of seats where the Liberal Party had actually come in fourth. I mean, he had a list of about 15 at one stage and they were coming after Labor, One Nation, obviously, and the Greens as well. So it isn't just that they're losing seats, is that they are actually almost irrelevant, Walter, in a whole range of seats where they would normally be either winning or coming second to Labor.
Yeah, well, they have no credibility, which I think is a very hard place to come from in terms of electoral results. And just to go back to what Tory was alluding to as well, in terms of every time they get drubbed at an election, there's this, we need to go further to the right. On Channel 7 last night, they had, also on the ABC, they had Anne Ruston, who was very much calling for that. You need to appeal to, as Ashton Hearn was saying, the sort of bread and butter issues that people actually care about. Over on Channel 7, they've got Alex Antic, who's leaning in hard, saying we should have scrapped net zero earlier. We need to go further into the right. This is exactly, people criticise me for trying to stack branches with far-right Christians from the churches in the southern suburbs, which they did a few years ago now, and David Spears was tied up in that as well. And that's kind of led to this split where you have moderate leaders like Ashton Hearn and I guess Vincent Tarzia as well, trying to put on that sort of face, lead the party to bring it back to the centre and be kind of electorally viable. But at the same time, the apparatus, the rank and file of the party has been pushed further and further to the right by people like Alex Antic, who now are sitting back and saying, "Oh, look at this! Is exactly what we told you would happen." It's like, no, well, you kind of made this happen. That has led to this result where they've been particularly sort of self-destructive. So, how that will play out, it's almost as if the Liberals were set up to fail in order to make further arguments for them to go further to the right, which obviously isn't a path to government. What it's a path to, I guess, is a question for Alex Antic. And the fact that he's been speaking about One Nation in such glowing terms makes you think, is he planning to join Corey at some point?
Well, we've talked about this before on the Sunday Shot, and I don't know that he will, because if he's still leading the Senate ticket, then he will still get elected, and that would seem to be, if he wants to stay in federal parliament at the moment, he's in a pretty good wicket. So I don't know that he will, but we'll wait and see. I mean, the thing about the Liberal Party is that because they now have so few seats, as I say, they've been driven out of metropolitan Adelaide apart from Bragg, but they just don't have the talent. So Ashton Hearn will stay on as Liberal leader, it seems. But, they've lost Vincent Tarzia, who had proven to be quite a good campaigner in the past and then held on against, Nick Xenophon in 2018. But he's now gone. As I said, all of the former ministers who had retired, none of their seats have been held. So it is only in, the four kind of seats. I've got so Finnis, we can look at the seats that they are likely to hold. So they'll Bragg, which, is the safer seat. Flinders, Chafee looks like they might get there. There are a number of seats, and I think we should note this, where because everything has been upended, the Electoral Commission had picked the wrong two candidates to follow the preferences through. So it is quite possible that in a number of these seats, who is currently coming second might be leapfrogged. So in the seat of Hyson, for example, which was a seat that the Greens had invested a lot of time and money in, and they very much hoped to snatch. That's where the Libs deputy leader, Josh Teague, is running. At the moment, it looks like Labor might snatch that one too, because the Greens have performed quite well, but if they're not well enough to come second. So in that scenario, you've just the future of the party has also been decapitated, Tory. It's hard to know how they rebuild, despite Ashton Hearn's sort of rousing speech when she conceded defeat yesterday.
Yeah, and it has financial implications for them as well. But look, you're right. I mean, I cannot make that caveat strongly enough about the ability for somebody to leapfrog in one of these seats. I think in Pinnis at the last election, the independent was ahead by 10%, and I think it was almost declared, and then she was leapfrogged, and that could happen still in a number of seats, which could change that formula of how many Liberal seats and how many One Nation seats. So that would maybe give a small glimmer of hope to Ashton Hearn. But yeah, when you have so few people and then you become so dependent just on your leader, that is in no way an election winning strategy at the next election and potentially the one after that. Having said that, I feel like the world is so unpredictable right now. Anything, I can't rule anything in or out. Don't really like making predictions anymore. But yeah, they need to rebuild both at the branch level and the party level, and that's from a position of hanging on by your fingertips.
Yeah, so you were actually at the One Nation party last night. Give us some insights into the mood there. Who was there? Like, who were the type of people that they had managed to attract to be their volleys on the ground? And then we might talk a little bit about One Nation's track record once they do get into Parliament.
Sure. Well, first of all, I only managed to scrape in. I got stopped by someone who said I was the fucking ABC and wasn't coming in because they weren't allowed in. And then once I was in, it was like, who let the fucking Guardian in? So it was not a welcome presence, I think it's fair to say. And look, I was surprised it was quite empty when I first got in, but it very quickly filled up. Look, predominantly white, predominantly older, lots of very excited, very passionate people. I mean, I wrote in my piece today, it's that feeling of actually when you're in the room of the people who are going to win government.
Yeah.
Becomes Pauline Hanson, our next premier sort of thing. So it was a lot of hype, a lot of hollering, a lot of chanting. So some of the people in the room, and actually the Carlos Coimbra, who is likely to be the second upper house person,
who was the president of One Nation in South Australia.
Yeah, and was the lead candidate before Bernardi leapfrogged him. He did a really interesting shout out. He thanked Channel 7 and Channel 9 for the One Nation search, which I'm sure they'll be really happy with. He thanked Sky News' Paul Murray, and then he went on to thank people who were in the room. So Monica Smith, if people remember her from COVID days, she led a lot of that anti-lockdown kind of activism.
Yeah.
And Turning Point Australia, which is our branch of that MAGA-aligned, Trumpian Charlie Kirk organisation, which is really a sort of, hard right Christian thing, which is now set up here.
And they've registered as an interested third party, so because they're raising money and they're giving money and profile to One Nation.
Exactly, and maybe when we talk about the changes in laws, we can get across some of that. So that was pretty interesting. So there were the sort of supporters, and then there were these kind of influencer types hovering around as well. So, we'll never know, but I would love to know how social media and how that whole, dark corners of the internet have also fueled the popularity of One Nation. I feel like I'm so severely offline these days that I don't have a good sense
of where it's all coming from.
Yeah.
I mean, Walter, there is the thing. I mean, the elephant in the room for One Nation is that they don't seem to be able to hold themselves together as a party when they are required to do actual work. When everybody was alluding back to Queensland in 1998, in the early days of One Nation, when they won 11 seats in the Queensland Parliament, and I think within a year they barely had 2 representatives still under the One Nation rubric. They always seem to implode, and this is what happened with their sole legislative councillor who was elected in 22, unexpectedly. South Australia had before then, and certainly before now, had actually resisted One Nation's siren call, even as they have in the past been very open to third parties like Nick Xenophon and his team, whether it was Central Alliance and then SA Best and so on. So it's unusual that South Australia has embraced One Nation to this extent. But can you talk a little bit about that and then potentially projections for the future based on past track record?
Yeah, I mean, and Pauline Hanson did invoke that 1998 election, result at her speech last night, which, as you said, maybe come back to bite her if everything falls apart again. But yeah, this isn't the first time South Australia has elected a One Nation MLC. At the 2022 election, Sarah Game was elected on the ticket. And One Nation hadn't really run a campaign, really, in South Australia that election. Sarah was elected with almost literally no public profile, almost by accident. Her mum was the lead federal candidate for One Nation at the time, so she was just on the ticket. And surely enough, when you just lob some random person into Parliament, the party allegiances aren't always particularly strong. She left the party pretty quickly. And that's one of many curious little footnotes in this election where she's now tried to start her own political movement called the Fair Go Party, which has been just this kind of comical series of failures where I think maybe 3 weeks before the election, she got rid of her previous lead candidate. So she's not running. She's got an 8-year term, but she's trying to get other people in on her name, her brand. And so she ditched this ex-Liberal young guy to bring in Chris McDermott, who in Adelaide in South Australia is a famous ex-Crow, a footballer, has done a lot of charity work for children, stuff like that. So he was kind of, shoehorned in as this candidate that could speak to more mainstream voters. But they had this big falling out just, a little over a week before the election. So we had this extraordinary scenario where Sarah Game is doing these, direct-to-camera videos on social media, begging people not to vote for her above the line for her name because it will go to this guy that she's broken up with, essentially. So if that's an indication of what we can expect from whoever One Nation has got elected this time around, it's going to be a pretty interesting couple of years. And whether or not, One Nation can have, as I said, that kind of credibility, that sense of being a real party, a real force in politics, can sustain it over this parliamentary term to come back around for the next election or even into the federal election, I'm not particularly convinced. I'll be interested to watch it.
No, I mean, and I do think, we've seen this before, even with Pauline, sort of surrounding herself with high-profile male political leaders, who she then gets kind of pissed off with because they are starting to get more media than she is, or somehow she decides they're trying to usurp her crown. I thought, how she and Barnaby Joyce are going to go, she and Corey Bernardi are going to go. Will that be the same as her and Mark Latham, and that it will implode sort of spectacularly, and that One Nation will continue on its, historical path of having these surges where it becomes the party where people park their votes and I think this was an effective strategy of Bernardi's when he talked about the uni party and that the two major parties are not working for the little people. And that's where I think that the dangers for Labor are starting to become evident as well, in the fact that they're really the heartland of their party, these sort of very working class northeastern suburbs, Salisbury and Elizabeth, as I referred to before. For a while, it looked like some of those seats could be at risk. And certainly there's been massive swings against the government to One Nation in sort of Salisbury, Elizabeth, in the seats of Light and Taylor. Now, Koutsantonis was always very confident on the panel last night at the ABC that they would actually retain them, and it looks like they probably will. But Tory, it is saying something about the way that a lot of people who perhaps don't have particular party allegiances are now approaching politics. And there are going to be implications not just for Labor, but potentially for the Community Independence Project too, if One Nation sort of successfully becomes the place where disaffected voters can go, rather than these sort of independent community movements which have had success in the past 2 elections.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, if I can come in at that on a tangent, one of the most confounding kind of moments in the campaign was Cory Bernardi dressed in expensive brand name gear, kind of going into homeless camps and talking to people, and then kind of relating that to the housing crisis and cost of living. And I'll just leave that image with you. So there was
the same image of them flying around in Gina Reinhardt's private jet.
Yeah, I mean, and Barnaby Joyce conceded, like, yeah, she's funding us, great.
Yeah,
Australia's richest person, and I think Peter Malinowskis actually capitalised on that quite well. You know, Pauline says she's out there for the battlers, but she's flying around in the private jet of a billionaire. I don't know how much traction that got. So there was a YouGov poll in the Advertiser, I think on Thursday, that showed more than 50% of the people planning to vote for One Nation were doing it just because they didn't like the other parties.
Yeah.
So absolutely a protest vote. They capitalised on that. So as you say, you know, calling Labor and Liberal the uni party is probably really quite effective. And this is what they do. And, you know, many smarter people than me have pointed this out. They set up this kind of air of grievance. Is your life better than it used to be? Doesn't it suck a bit? Don't you feel threatened by the outside world? Don't you have these general anxieties and fears and you want somebody to do something about it? So they set that up. They don't give any of the answers to that. They say, we get you, you know, come to us. Those guys haven't been helping you. Come to us. We'll endorse your grievances, talk a bit about cost of living, but mostly about net zero and voice to Parliament. And yet for people who are hurting and struggling, that's it's working for them.
That was enough. And what I do find extraordinary is you think about the effort that the independents at a federal level in particular, but also people like Lou Nicholson in Finniss at a state level, the work that they have to do, the engagement that they are, you know, the analogue campaigning that they're doing on the ground, the door knocking, trying to get name recognition up. And then One Nation sort of just swans in, has the brand recognition of the party, but no one knows who the candidates were. Often the candidates had just been sort of flown in. We had a few late controversies about that because, well, one of them, it was unclear if they existed at all, and it turns out that they probably did, but they had no online footprint at all. But another one, on election day itself, it was revealed that so there had been questions about whether or not he was actually living in South Australia at all, running for the seat of Adelaide. And then it turned out that he was actually on the run from charges of sexual touching in the UK, which is the reason why he had changed his name from Trent to AOI or like. But I guess the broader point about that, yes, One Nation's kind of crazy candidates is par for the course, but that the brand of One Nation is now stepping up so that the individual candidates don't actually matter for people who are parking their votes with them.
Well, I would have predicted wrongly, which is great, not to do the predictions, that more people who had indicated they would vote for One Nation would get in there and go, where's Pauline Hanson? That's who I thought I was voting for, and then would have maybe gone with other independents. But you're right, it held up, and the brand is the only explanation for that. Brand recognition plays a huge role. So how community independents battle that is really tricky. And particularly, as you said earlier, in South Australia, we have all these independents, but it's nothing like a teal movement or, you know, there's no kind of, I was going to say coherent, I mean more like a cohesive policy that binds them all together. They're all on their own, and that makes it so much harder when you're battling the kind of giant brand of One Nation.
Yeah. Walter, do you think that there are, I mean, Pauline had been, at least in the lead up to the election itself, she'd been sort of downplaying what long-term lessons there might be to be drawn from South Australia, and that the real test of One Nation's surging popularity was going to be Farah. She's singing a different tune now that it has all worked out for her in South Australia. But what do you think this means, Walter, for the contest that may be developing now of those who are seeking to capitalise on disaffection with the major parties?
Well, one thing in terms of the independence that we do have, the Xenophon movement has kind of fizzled out a little bit. And so in most cases, I think the independents we do have, as we were saying before, they're largely disgraced ex-liberals. So it's hard to really gauge whether there's a real groundswell of independence there as there are in other states. But in terms of the One Nation, their messaging, I thought it was interesting to see Cory Bernardi, particularly, in the Liberal Party, he's known to politics, but he was always kind of the weird cousin off to the side. The Liberal Party never put him front and centre, but he's really, compared to some of the other people in One Nation, their talent, he's kind of almost tried to adopt this sort of statesman-like aura, and he's been doing all this content. So One Nation flew this young guy who's been shadowing Cory to make all these social media reels where he's been going, into homeless camps, into public housing, standing outside of, university buildings with the Ghana language saying, what does this mean? Because, and these are things that he's just playing for the Facebook market, and they're posting these things to Facebook. They're not putting a lot of money into sponsoring them, but they're just taking off in a very organic way. And, for all the talk of, we're not just a protest, we're not just fueling grievances, a lot of their campaign, as far as I've seen Cory's campaign, it's him standing in front of things going, oh, I'm angry about this. Let's get One Nation and maybe we'll do something about it. It's really just feeding into that kind of the Facebook mindset, which I think is the ecosystem where a lot of this disaffection is kind of taking root and growing.
Yeah. And, if they are on par with the Liberals in Parliament, then that is not going to be enough. Or otherwise, if we're just going to perpetuate this situation where there is actually no opposition. So all of the criticisms of Malinowskis and Labor will just fall on very limited ears if they're being mounted at all, and Labor can just get on and do whatever it is that they want to do. And as we've seen, that can result in very poor outcomes for the state. I mean, we all know that the empty Pioneer Women's Gardens this week during festival time was as a direct result of Malinowskis deciding to intervene in the programming of Adelaide Writers' Week, and the board of the Adelaide Festival behaving shamefully and capitulating to but what was completely improper pressure that was being brought to bear by Malinowskis individually. So he may kind of claim he is this centrist figure, and he is, but he is also a right-wing shoppy who, has firm views that he now thinks as this sort of emperor of South Australia, his views matter. I mean, it was a very devastating thing for the literary community, generally Tory, but it also said something about the type of leader that Malinowskis was, that he would get himself so involved in essentially a programming decision of the Adelaide Festival.
Yeah, look, if I can just flick back to the opposition idea for a second.
Yeah, of course.
Stood up and announced Cory Bernardi as her lead candidate, and somebody asked her about policies, and she said, oh, it's nothing to do with me. I don't know anything about South Australian policies. And then that became an attack line for Labor. They don't have any policies, to which their answer was, look at our website. It has policies on it. Sure.
Yeah.
Hopefully once you actually get into Parliament, that shallowness really does get exposed. And look, on Malinowskis, I still have no idea why he got so involved in Writers' Week. He didn't need to. He has previously said, don't agree with that person, but it's not up to me. It's up to other people to make these programming decisions. It felt like he became the spokesperson for that decision, whether that was because there was a vacuum because other people weren't talking about it. So the fury about that on the ground was huge, but I suppose contained to a small enough part of the community that it's not going to take much off him. And people at the time sort of said, well, where are they going to go? They'll go to the Greens.
Yeah.
No harm, no foul. And it's a similar thing with Festival Plaza development, with other infringements on the parklands, with this focus on, I guess, your blokey kind of motorsports and the big sort of what Ashton Hearn kept calling the razzle dazzle events. Whereas previously we'd had the Liberal Premier Stephen Marshall, who was like, go the Fringe, go the festival, go right, very, very much culturally left in that way. So yeah, he's moved to centre, business on side, and these people that is kind of pissing off the vote will probably end up coming back to him anyway. I mean, I sort of feel like when you take a bunch of those sorts of issues together, you start to get a more meaningful chunk of the community. But that obviously hasn't translated.
It hasn't translated. Look, one of the things about this election as well was it was the first election that was run under South Australia's new electoral laws. We've talked on the Sunday Shot previously about the impact of the changes to electoral laws which are happening around the country, particularly in Victoria as well and at a federal level. We interviewed Anne Twomey a few weeks ago when we were talking about the High Court challenges that were happening to a lot of the protest and anti-hate legislation that was happening. But we also talked about the electoral laws, what they were doing and what they had been designed to do as well, which by some reading of them is to try and entrench major parties or legacy parties in power and make it more difficult for kind of insurgents and independents to get a toehold in Parliament. So we're going to play that interview with Anne now, and then we're going to come back and talk a little bit about how South Australia's laws were different and what impact our panel thinks they may have had on this election. At the moment, there are two challenges going on in relation to restrictions on the rights of independents to challenge the major parties. One is from some Victorian laws and the other is the federal laws that were introduced last year and successfully passed in what people are arguing was the major parties getting together to freeze out and to make it harder for independents to successfully win seats. So it's former member for Goldstein, Zoe Daniel, former Senator Rex Patrick. They're bringing a case arguing that the restrictions on the amount of money that people can raise, can spend on elections, and the amount of money that individuals and organisations can donate, both having been capped, that is in itself somehow an abrogation of the implied right of political communication. Can you talk us through that?
Sure. Okay, so in past cases, the High Court has held that restrictions on donations, for example, and restrictions on expenditure in political campaigns, they can affect the way political parties can communicate with people. So they have a burden on your implied freedom of political communication. So that's how it sneaks in. And so when you look at these cases, though, the court says, well, are you doing it for a legitimate purpose? And in the past, the court has said, well, a legitimate purpose can be, for example, trying to prevent the risk or the reality of corruption. Okay, so political donations can create that risk or reality of corruption. And also, if your law is directed at trying to create a more even playing field for people, so to make it fairer, elections fairer. So they're good legitimate purposes, and if your law is directed at those legitimate purposes, and it's reasonably appropriate and adapted to achieve them, then Bob's your uncle, your law is valid. Okay, that's the stuff that we've had in the past. So now we get to these challenges in relation to this newly passed federal law. The system that it created of itself is actually quite good. So it actually is a good thing to have caps on donations and caps on expenditure. We want to bring down expenditure in these political campaigns to make it fairer for people and, frankly, not to bombard us all with ads all the time that drive us nuts. and we want to be able to limit donations so that the rich don't have the possibility of obtaining undue influence over politicians. So in the scheme of things, that's a good thing. Equally, another thing it was directed at was initially trying to get rid of what's known as dark money out of the system, and that is money that no one's accountable for, because they had a very high disclosure threshold, up to around $17,000. If you donated under that, then you could get through without anyone knowing that you were donating. And you think, well, does 17,000 buy you influence? Well, it might, if it's spread over 17,000 for a whole lot of different candidates, etc. So you can build up your money by spreading it. And this becomes a big issue in this particular fight. All right, so the system as it was, in its broadness, is actually a good one. And so structurally, there's some good things in that legislation. Where it all became bad, however, was when the political parties, the major parties, got together and did a deal in order to favour their particular interests. And so that includes things like making very high donation thresholds. So, your donation threshold, well, put it this way, when these laws were first started in New South Wales, the donation threshold that you could give was $5,000. At the Commonwealth level, what is it? Oh, $50,000. Okay, and it's not just $50,000 that you can donate to, a political party, full stop. It's $50,000, but you can do that across every single state and party branch across the country. And so that can take you up to $450,000. And that's annually, by the way. And then you can also donate to friendly associated entities, for example, and then and third-party campaigners, and that racks it up higher. So you get up to $1.6 million annually you can donate. And, is this seriously affecting, trying to take money out of the system so that no one can influence? Yeah, you can buy influence for $1.6 million annually, frankly. And so the argument that they're making of saying, well, this is to achieve a legitimate interest of, getting rid of the risk or the perception of corruption or undue influence. Well, they're not achieving that legitimate interest because the way that they've structured it and the level of the caps is such that it's not reasonably appropriate and adapted to achieve that outcome. Okay. So let's get down to the issue then about independence and why Zoe Daniel and Rex Patrick are challenging. There's a number of things going on here. And one of them in particular is expenditure caps. Now, again, you'd think, okay, that's a sensible thing to do. Let's make it fair. Everybody gets to spend the same amount in an electorate, right? And, if that was so, then yeah, maybe it would be okay. But one of the problems here is that the main political parties are able to spread their money across electorates. So even though you have a cap in a particular electorate saying you can spend this amount of money and no more, a party can come in over the top of that and say, well, we've got another cap nationally. We can move our money around in circles and flood it into this particular electorate, and we can spend above that cap that was put there, so long as we do it without mentioning the name of the candidate and the name of the electorate, but we can still advertise as the political party for there. And so one of the effects of this is that the poor independent who's campaigning in that particular electorate can only spend up to the set cap, whereas the parties can move money around and put in their party recognition and campaigning above. So that's sort of problem number one with it. Problem number two is there's a whole political funding, public funding thing going on there, and independents, particularly if you're running for the first time or your new parties, you don't get advance funding. So that's not going into your campaign account to spend either. Then there's the nominated entities thing. So political parties have their own, what are known as nominated entities. So they are basically big funds of money that they can use and spend on things. And they can, again, use those and transfer money around without having any cap on that as a political donation. So an independent in an electorate is really confined in terms of what money that they can collect in order to be able to spend on an election, because they're limited in terms of the donations that they're allowed to receive. They don't get to spread donations across the country and move them around. So they're much more limited in what they can receive. They're limited in terms of the public funding that they get as well. And then they're limited in terms of what they can spend in comparison to parties. So the essential problem with the legislation is that it's very much skewed to favour major parties, particularly those that are already in existence and that have nominated entities. It's very much skewed against independents and new parties. And when you come back to those legitimate purposes, not only do you have issues with, it doesn't achieve the let's get rid of the risk of corruption in terms of donations, but it also doesn't achieve the let's get a level playing field going here, because the playing field is very much tipped to one direction.
And it was that issue of it being unfair that has already caused government solicitors in Victoria to concede that some of the way that their legislation had been framed probably was constitutionally invalid, and that was to do with banning these friendly associated entities from being established at all for any parties other than Labor, Liberal and the Nats. They were in existence before 2020. Is that right?
That's right. So that's a case called Hopper. That case has already been heard by the High Court, so we're waiting to get a judgment on that. The Victorian legislation is far worse than the Commonwealth legislation. If you were sort of to try and, put a little a curve saying which are the worst, the Commonwealth is bad, but not anywhere near as bad as the Victorian.
Right.
The Victorian was so blatantly manipulated to benefit the three major parties, the ones who had these nominated entities, and interestingly, the cap on donations there is really, really low. So it means that an independent has very little chance of getting enough money to be able to fund their campaign through donations, while at the same time, in the main political parties, you could have these nominated entities that basically could flood an enormous amount of money into those political parties to run their campaigns. And as you said, they actually had it done in such a way that no one could create one of these things in the future. So it was a legacy benefit to existing parties. I was speaking to someone recently about that legislation and the challenge, and they said it's absolutely inevitable that Victoria is going to lose that challenge. And lawyers are usually pretty reluctant to say that. But the flippant comment was made, it's really just a matter of which ones of the various grounds it goes down on. So that was very poor legislation, and I would I agree with the person I was speaking with. I expect that one would lose.
And if that does lose, does that make it more likely that Zoe and Rex's challenge might also get up, or are they fundamentally arguing on different grounds? And as you say, the Victorian legislation was so much worse that you can't draw any conclusions from that.
It would be, wise for everyone just to wait and see what happens with the Victorian one, because the arguments that come out and the findings in the judgment there will have potentially an impact on the Commonwealth one. Having said that, the Commonwealth rules about nominated entities are different from Victoria's, and also the caps on donations, etc., are different as well. So it won't necessarily have a huge impact, but it might, to the extent that the court goes into the more fundamental principles of crime.
So, Tory, South Australia seems to have avoided a High Court challenge at all. It has been framed in a different way, but it essentially banned donations to existing political parties, indies and MPs, and replaced donations with public money. Can you just talk us through a little bit about the South Australian laws and how they did impact on the running of this election?
Well, I've got to tell you, it felt very much like the Electoral Commission was kind of fumbling its way through, building the plane while they're flying it with these new laws. So yeah, ban on political donations, which on the surface, widely celebrated. The rest is politics. Referred to Malinowskis as their hero over this and the social media ban. What people who are not in the major parties would say is that just locks in a lot more funding for the majors through that, whatever their share of the vote. Oh, I said for the majors, not so much. It looks a lot of money in for Labor.
Yeah.
Not so much for the other people through that public funding model. And then there are all these other ways around it. Like there are levies that people can put so that they get money that way. And then what I got a little bit upset, maybe a little bit too obsessed with as well, is that you can register as a third party. So two of the people who registered as third parties for this election was Turning Point Australia, who we talked about earlier, and a very prominent anti-abortion activist, Joanna Howe, also registered as a third. And now they can fundraise and spend money. There are subcaps. I think it's $450,000 or something, but they can do a lot in that space as long as they're not actually lobbying for a specific part, using that money and colluding somehow with a party. But both those people very firmly endorsed One Nation. Turning Point Australia had how to vote cards for One Nation. I'm not suggesting there was any colluding. I'm just saying sitting outside the system are all these other people able to get money, spend money, and do all this work. And then, I mean, the other interesting example was, as we discussed, that Bernardi and Hanson were flying around in Gina Rinehart's plane. The way that unfolded was really interesting because I'd written about Turning Point Australia and Joanna Howe, and somebody went, well, hold on, how can Gina Rinehart donate the use of a private plane to One Nation? And it was very hard to get an answer to how that fell under the rules, because there's the exemptions that Anne spoke about for federal spending, and Hanson's federal. So was it sort of to do with that, or was there some other kind of exemption? And then Pauline Hanson stood up and went, "Oh, it's nothing to do with me. Corey's going to pay for the plane." And I heard that and I was like,
really?
No, I didn't on that one. He said he's going to pay it all back. I mean, these planes, they had 3 days flying around, and I saw estimates of between up to $15,000 an hour.
Yeah,
for that. So yeah, we will be watching keenly to see whether the invoice gets issued and paid. Yeah,
I have a suspicion that it may well not. Walter, there has also been conversations about South Australia having, apart from the ACT, I think the only truth in sort of advertising laws around election campaigns. But they have been around for a while, so there may be a bit more attention on them now, but that hasn't fundamentally impacted on this particular election.
No, as we were saying before, I think that relates mainly to printed official, with the authorised election materials. There's still a whole lot of crazy stuff being bandied around in the kind of the social media space and through other kind of third parties. I'm not really sure. Tory might have been keeping a closer eye on that one.
Yeah. Look, we love it when the rest of the country pays attention to us down here in the middle bottom bit.
Yeah.
It's been a ride. And look, on paper, it's really great. But as Walter said, it's quite narrow. We're not suddenly magically a bullshit-free zone down here because of these laws. It's authorised electoral material. And again, the interwebs, they're just full of the misinformation. It doesn't cover when people are just talking. And it's also, the process to go, well, hold on, that's not actually true. But then you've got to challenge it and take it to the commission. And I'm going to mangle that saying about, a lie gets halfway around the world before the truth puts its pants on in the morning.
Yeah.
And also I was reading that there's been a huge number of complaints, but sometimes it's like a weaponized thing, it's people are just saying, oh, let's challenge that just as a, almost as a vexatious litigant kind of scenario. So look, it's a great thing. Wouldn't it be amazing if we had just truth in the world rules?
Yeah, no, that would be a lovely thing indeed. Look, we are coming close to the end of today's South Australian election special. Walter, just to end, with this ringing endorsement, but a few landmines, as Pauline said, been left behind with the new MPs coming in, inexperienced MPs who may yet just implode. What do you think Malinowskis's approach is going to be? I mean, his victory speech was quite interesting. I mean, I don't know. I've been making jokes about him being a man of sport and not letters after Writers' Week debacle, but he quoted Lawson at some length to try and reinforce that we are a nation and South Australia is a state of migrants. There are new, there are old Australians. We're all in it together. It was very centrist projection that he made on election night. How will he carry that through?
Yeah, it was an odd choice. No one was really asking for a lengthy Henry Lawson poetry recital, but he went there, and it was a deep cut as well. Like that one was not online, but very much. I think a lot of that speech was kind of trying to refashion some of the sentiment of the Pauline Hanson, the One Nation, the reactionary, the sort of patriotism, and refashion that patriotism message into something more centrist, more recognisable, that someone like Malinowskis, and even a model for the Albanese government, to try and reclaim that ground and change that message. The poem also is a very assimilationist one as well, by the end of it. So he's kind of rejecting the sort of xenophobia and anti-immigration sentiment of the One Nation, but also trying to reinforce that, once you do get here, you're an Australian, and reinforce that kind of compliance, which I thought was interesting. And also the other thing, just in terms of Malinowskis' messaging, there was one line that stuck out to me from his speech, that we would be a place that celebrates capital as well as labour, so everyone has a seat at the table of opportunity. And I think that was Marx that he was quoting there. I think that really says a lot about his brand of labour politics. And I do think, with a Labor government like that, who has courted business, who has, courted developers, what real estate is there, figuratively and literally, for the Liberal Party to capitalise on?
Yeah. And, business have embraced him. I mean, the government was being endorsed, as we said at the start, by all sorts of different sectional interests from across, normally, the political spectrum. So, Emperor Mali lives to not just, play another game and win another day, but really has cemented his position, and people talking about him as being one of the Labor greats. So we shall wait and see. And it will be very interesting just to see as these seats sort of solidify, and if One Nation can get those 3 seats, if Libs only really do get 4, although it's possible that they will sneak back in Hyson, depending on who comes second, what that is going to mean, and how, if at all, the Liberal Party and One Nation will have to work together. Who will get to be on the crossbench versus the opposition benches. So there's a lot still to come in the South Australian election results. So I want to thank Walter and Tory for getting up on a Sunday morning to talk us through, particularly Tory, who had a late night at the One Nation get together. Before we go, as ever, we will ask if you have any top tips. They can be related to the South Australian election, or might be something entirely different coming up in the next week. Walter, anything from you?
I've heard that the ABC have just put online or broadcast Randa Abdel Fattah and Louise Adler's speech, which happened in Adelaide a few weeks ago. Would have been coinciding with Writers' Week, but happened at the Town Hall sold-out event. I was there. It was a great event, really salient stuff. Bizarre that the Premier felt the need to intervene and blow up a whole festival to kind of stop her speaking in Adelaide. But that's now publicly available, and I recommend people check that out because it was a very interesting chat.
Yeah, great.
My cat knocked something over.
Of Writers' Week. We love a cat who gets involved. Tory, a top tip from you.
Well, look, embarrassingly, I'm going to go Writers' Week as well, at which I was meant to sit alongside Walter Marsh and talk about his book, The Butterfly Thief. And then we were also set to do it at the Alternative Writers' Week, and then I dumped him and flew off to Sydney. So, Walter, I'm sorry. People out there, The Butterfly Thief, it's a rollicking ride. It's a museum heist. It's got amazing characters.
Yeah.
Get amongst it.
Get out and buy Walter's book and buy the books of the other
Although I should say,
authors and
without wanting
speakers
to plug my other book, Young Rupert, about young Rupert Murdoch, shades of the Playford era, I think, in the new Malinowskis epoch that we're going into. That's my other tip, my own book.
That is, yeah, absolutely. That is a very good read, I will say. The young Rupert, we had Walter back on the Shot podcast years ago when we were just a little ad hoc audio event as opposed to our weekly commitment that we make now to you, our viewers. Thank you very much for joining us on the South Australian special that was the Sunday Shot. We will be back next week. In fact, I will not be back next week because I am back in Artsland, but Dave will be back. And that reminds me, my top tip is for Melbourne audiences. Now is your chance to buy tickets to Fuckboys Live in concert, coming to the Comedy Festival, opening on Thursday, and which attracted 5-star reviews at the Adelaide Fringe all round. So you don't want to miss out on that. You will miss me next week, but Dave will be back for another edition, another episode of the Sunday Shot. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Joe.
Thanks, Joe.